Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted, and welcome back to part B of our lecture regarding the Vietnam era. Now, we left off talking about Nixon's election in 1968. And one of his first priorities, and the thing that would dominate his first couple years in office, is going to be the Vietnam War. It is still raging when he takes office. And remember, Nixon said he had a plan to bring an end to the war in Vietnam, as he called it, peace with honor. Now, despite his claim to having such a plan, peace would come neither quickly nor honorably. The war would drag on in the early 1970s, with the death toll rising. Now, ultimately, Nixon's plan to deal with the issue in Vietnam was a plan known as Vietnamization. It was to gradually reduce the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam, justifying the reduction as a result of what he called the Vietnamization of the war, or the policy of equipping and training the South Vietnamese forces to assume the burden of combat. That sounds familiar. Oh, yeah, that's pretty much been our policy ever since. We used it most recently in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2010s. And this is a common strategy. So we're going to pull our troops out, but before we pull them out officially, we're going to train the local troops to do the job instead. And we're also going to give them weapons, so we can also sell them guns, which on the one hand sounds great. We're equipping them. On the other hand, we make a lot of money. And so in 1969, there are approximately 560,000 troops in Vietnam. Again, we're at that high point from 68. And this will lead to a steady decrease in the number of troops until by 1973, there were just 50,000 remaining. Now, on the one hand, this sounded pretty good. On the other hand, though, while simultaneously decreasing our ground troop presence, Nixon would also expand our air war in 1969, would include heavy bombing of North Vietnam in order to force them to come to the negotiating table. But Nixon didn't just bomb North Vietnam. He also would bomb the communist sanctuary of Cambodia, a so-called neutral nation. And this bombing would spark a new wave of anti-war protests here at home. College campuses across the country would erupt in rage, with student protests leading to the closing of hundreds of colleges and universities. At Kent State University, 1970, the Ohio National Guard would be called in to quell the rioting, in which had led to an ROTC building on campus being burned down by anti-war protesters. Okay, this was wrong. They burned down a building. But the National Guardsmen opened fire on the unarmed demonstrators, killing 4 student bystanders. That's what you see pictured here. You know what's sad? A poll showed that the American public supported the National Guard, saying that students had essentially gotten what they were asking for. No, I'm pretty sure they were asking for peace. They were tired of war and death. The thing is, this anti-war demonstrator, this was not a new thing for Chicanos. They needed no convincing. They fully understood and believed that the war in Vietnam was illegal. And so when news reports came about the mistreatment of indigenous peoples by American troops, they really weren't too shocked. But it only angered them more. And it only intensified as Nixon took over by the early 1970s. Now, in addition to the constant bombing of Cambodia and Laos, this represented an expansion of the war, right? We're no longer just bombing and attacking North Vietnam, who is our perceived enemy here. We're attacking neighboring countries. This is expanding the war, not drawing back troops. This also included what's called the Strategic Hamlet program, which was a military operation that called for the destruction of Vietnamese homes and communities so as to destroy a potential resource for enemies. So the U.S. military would destroy civilian homes out of fear that the enemy might use them as resources. Now, this is not a new war strategy. Tons of nations have used it throughout history. It was kind of a scorched earth tactic. The Spanish did it in Mexico. The Russians did it in their own country during the wars. During the U.S. Civil War, General Sherman literally burned a path from the Mississippi River all the way to the Atlantic Ocean across the South, including burning Atlanta to the ground to cut off the South and their supply chains and their resources. But here you have the U.S. in a foreign country killing civilians and destroying civilian homes and property. And then maybe the worst of all was the My Lai massacre, where U.S. troops executed anywhere from 200 to 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians. And this just galvanized the Chicano community. Again, it galvanized the anti-war movement in general. But for Chicanos, what they see and what they hear when they learn about these events was, yeah, this is bad, but this is what's been going on for decades. This is the mistreatment of people of color, indigenous populations, by the U.S. and the U.S. military. And in addition, what really pushed it all together or galvanized the community was the war produced high casualty rates that for Chicanos represented a proportionally higher death rate than any other ethno-racial group in the U.S. Armed Forces. So, in comparison with their overall population numbers in the United States, they were dying at much more higher rates compared to other ethno-racial groups. And that fact pointed to just one conclusion for them: blatant, entrenched racism and classism that was working against Chicanos. Chicanos specifically, and the poor or people of color more generally. More than 170,000 Chicanos would participate in the Vietnam War. And while Chicanos made up less than 10% of the entire U.S. population, they had among the highest casualty rates. And again, it's hard to give exact numbers or percentages here because it's based on Mexicano surnames. And we all know that you could be Hispanic, but I have a Hispanic last name. You know, my wife and children's names are Olmsted. So if they were serving in the military, you would never know that they were Hispanic, whether, Mexicano or other Latino groups. And so it's difficult to know the exact numbers. But nonetheless, among the highest death rates and casualty rates were suffered among the Chicano community. And they began to even more push against the draft, more countless anti-war rallies that began to offer anti-draft counseling to Chicanos. They began to offer Chicano draft help. They became instrumental in trying to get La Raza deferments of draft notices. The Southwest Regional Counseling Association offered counseling sessions on how to appeal the draft. And their slogan became La batalla está aquí. The war is here. In other words, why are we fighting abroad and dying when the real fight is here at home? Fighting for equality, fighting for civil rights, fighting to come out of poverty. And it became a publication by Leah Ibarra and Nina Guerrera, an anti-war booklet that pleaded with Chicanos to not go overseas and kill brown people, but to stay at home and solve the problems that plague their own communities instead. This includes people like Jose Sanchez. 1968 became the first Chicano to publicly resist the draft. Now, I want to be clear here. Not all Chicanos were anti-war. Not all Chicanos were anti-draft. Not all Chicanos would ignore the draft notices. Not all protested, and many would serve and serve bravely for their country. Let me give you a few examples, though. People like Jay Vargas, U.S. Marine, who was wounded 3 times under intense mortar, artillery, and rocket fire. He refused aid and instead ran back into the battlefield to retrieve his wounded battalion. He received the Medal of Honor from President Nixon. Or Alfred Rascon, a Mexican-born Army medic, who repeatedly ran through heavy enemy fire to retrieve the wounded soldiers despite orders not to do so. He saved several soldiers by throwing himself on top of theirs to shield them from grenade blasts. Once the enemy fire had ended, he tended to the wounded prior to receiving aid for his own wounds. President Clinton in 2000 would present him with the Congressional Medal of Honor. The request for his Medal of Honor came from soldiers whose lives he had saved back in Vietnam, who had heard that Rascon had been overlooked and neglected for his services in the war. Or take the most famous of this group, Roy Benavidez. Roy Benavidez was one of 3 men from the state of Texas. Roy Benavidez is one of 3 men that the state of Texas has required high school students to remember for STAR test purposes. And I used to tell this joke, a kind of sad omission to the state of education in Texas. But the state of Texas, for high school students, required that students learn 3 Medal of Honor winners. They needed to know who Vernon Baker was, a white man from World War I, who Alvin York was, a black man from World War II, and they needed to know who Roy Benavidez was, Hispanic man, Vietnam. In other words, these 3 major wars of the 20th century, and the state of Texas said you need to know a white man, a black man, Hispanic man. Check, check, check. They filled their quota. They checked all the boxes. So they can say, see, we're being inclusive. Yeah. I say that with a lot of sarcasm. Because I think it's sad that that's the only reason we try to remember this man. A person who was a war hero. But we need to check a box because we need a Hispanic man on the test. Nonetheless, many Chicanos and other Latinos would serve bravely, despite and often in opposition to the protesters here at home. Now, finally, in 1973, the North and South Vietnam, the Viet Cong, will sign an agreement that will end the war. Even though in reality, the North Vietnamese never changed from its basic stance. In fact, they kept 150,000 troops in the South and remained committed to ending South Vietnamese, the regime, and reunifying the country under communism. The South Vietnamese only accepted this with Nixon's assurance that the U.S. would respond with full force should the North continue to invade the South. And on March 29, 1973, the last American combat troops left Vietnam, Within months, the fighting resumed. The South Vietnamese appealed to Nixon for help, but Congress refused. And by 1975, the North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, soon to be renamed Ho Chi Minh City after the North Vietnamese leader. Helicopters lifted officials of the U.S. Embassy to safety, the picture on your screen, while terrified South Vietnamese kept fighting to get on the helicopters. This is what peace with honor looked like. Us fleeing for our lives. But the war was over, leaving a terrible legacy. Almost 2 million combatants and civilians killed on all sides. 600,000 North Vietnamese soldiers and countless civilians. 58,000 Americans dead, 300,000 wounded. Another 2,500 declared missing. And finally, another 150,000 American soldiers suffering drug, alcohol addiction, or severe psychological disorders, including the yet undiagnosed PTSD. But beyond just the numbers, on a deeper level, the American loss in Vietnam suggested that democratic ideals were not so easily imposed in other nations. And there's also a tremendous sense of loss that we no longer trusted our government. Now, by 1972, it's another election year. Nixon's up for re-election. And with the Vietnam War winding down, Nixon was firmly fixated on being re-elected for 1972 election. And during the election, Nixon employed what has been called the Southern Strategy that was used to capture disaffected Southern white racist voters. Republicans like Nixon began to use Southern racist code words like states' rights to appeal to the white backlash against civil rights. Now, this did not begin in 1972, but this was the election when it really began to yield real results. But this was only one part of his broader strategy. Nixon also developed what he called Hispanic strategy. You see, in 1968, Nixon won the election, but Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic candidate, had received 90% of the Hispanic vote. Nixon had been informed that if he could just win 5% more of the Chicano vote in Texas, he would have won the state. Now, and I'm not going to go back to the map right now, but if you look back at the map from the 1968 election, most of the South voted for a Southern racist candidate. Texas still voted Democrat one more time, in large part because they still value the presidency and the hometown status of LBJ, and Humphrey was his vice president. But Nixon was informed that if he could just win 5% of the Hispanic vote in Texas, he would have won Texas. And so to rectify this for the 1972 election, Nixon adopts what was called the Hispanic Strategy to court brown middle America. He did so by giving high-level appointments in more government jobs to Mexican Americans. In 1970, he formed what was called the National Economic Development Association, or NADA, a national organization that was funded by state and federal agencies to promote private development in low-income areas, i.e. Black and brown areas. Democratic-leaning Mexican Americans not so affectionately called it nada, meaning nothing, as that was what they said it did in practice, but it sure sounded good. He also created a specific reach out into the Hispanic community, dubbed the Brown Mafia. Now, Nixon had created a network of community leaders to bring in the Latino vote. And this was a subgroup of a larger group known as the Committee to Re-elect the President, acronym CREEP. I think I work on these acronyms. And ultimately, it's kind of ironic because Creep is the one who is responsible for the break-in at Watergate that will lead to his resignation ultimately and lead to the beginning of the Watergate scandal. And so under Creep, this organization to re-elect the president, they formed a subgroup called the Brown Mafia. And basically, the Republicans threatened the Brown Mafia that if they didn't reach the goal of earning 20% of the Hispanic vote in the 72 election, in other words, they wanted to get, remember, I told you before that the Democratic candidate had won 90% of the Hispanic vote in 1968, right? Creep used mafia tactics, threatening local Mexican-American leaders and other Hispanic leaders, saying that if we don't reach 20%, Republicans that is, of the Hispanic vote in 1972, the Nixon administration was going to cut federal appointments and stop federal funding to Latinos. They used an ultimatum, threatening federal funding cuts and loss of appointments if they couldn't deliver at least 20% of the Latino vote for Nixon. Now, the Brown Mafia was effective because Nixon, in fact, actually got 31% of the Hispanic vote in 1972. But instead of rewarding Latinos, Nixon dismantled the war on poverty programs that helped the Mexicano communities, arguing that the poorer Mexicano communities didn't deserve his help because in reality it was only the affluent, wealthier Latinos who voted for him. But those poorer Latinos, they voted Democratic, so they don't deserve his help. He followed this up in 1973 by appointing Anglo Ann Armstrong to the post of White House aide on domestic Latino affairs. So this is hard to talk about because it's just so dumbfounding. Nixon appointed an Anglo woman, Ann Armstrong, to become the White House aide concerning domestic Latino affairs. You guys want to know what her qualifications were for being to this post, to getting this appointment? Her husband owned a large ranch and employed a number of Mexicanos. Yeah. That's the reward for helping to earn 31% of the vote. Here's a picture of the Brown Mafia speaking to Nixon. Now, it was also Nixon who would help to add the term Hispanic to the U.S. Census as a way to document and count those of Spanish-speaking descent. Remember, up to the 1970s, with the one exception of 1930, Cubans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans were just white on the U.S. Census. And Hispanic was embraced as a term of ethnicity, in which for the community, theoretically, would create and provide statistics for when making demands. So the majority of the Mexicano community would embrace this term. Now, people since then have argued, well, we don't like the term Hispanic because it's an imputed term given to us by Anglo-Americans, in this case, Nixon administration. And it's a fair criticism. But the idea was by creating this separate ethnicity on the U.S. Census, you would better be able to document and quantify problems among the community. Or when they're saying, we need help because we represent a major voting bloc or a major demographic, this now provided statistics to back up those statements. Of course, though, ultimately, what Nixon is most famous for is, of course, the Watergate Scandal. Now, I'm going to give you the very quick, oversimplified recap of this. So on June 16th, 1972, the summer before the election in November, 5 men who had financial ties to CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, would break into the Democratic National Headquarters in Washington, D.C., whose offices were at the Watergate Hotel and Office Building. The goal was to photocopy important files and install surveillance equipment. Yeah, really. Now, the 5 men would be arrested while they were caught breaking into the Watergate Hotel. Nixon put the entire weight of the presidency behind covering up the scandal, even paying the legal bills of the 5 men and paying them hush money to lie about their financial ties to CREEP and Nixon. When that didn't work, Nixon offered up what he called the hors d'oeuvres, which were 5 high-ranking officials that would take the fall. Now, this was all uncovered thanks to 2 intrepid reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. These 2 reporters would have a source who no one knew who it was. It was an anonymous source. They knew who it was. They would not reveal it. It wouldn't be until after his death in the early 2000s that former FBI agent Mark Felt would reveal himself to be their source. And these 2 men kept the Watergate scandal in the newspaper, making sure it didn't die off the press, making sure Nixon couldn't get away with it. And ultimately, these 5 high-ranking men would take the fall instead of Nixon. Nixon hoping that if you give what he called the hors d'oeuvres, the appetizer, perhaps the Justice Department and the press, the journalists, won't come back for the main course, him. And so he offered up these 5, the White House General Counsel, John Dean, John Mitchell, the Attorney General and head of CREEP, Haldeman, the hatchet man, Chief of Staff, Jeb Magruder, Assistant to the Chief of Staff, and G. Gordon Liddy, former FBI agent. These are all high-ranking U.S. officials, high-ranking members of the Nixon administration. And it seemed like it was working until word got out that there were audio tapes that recorded every conversation that took place in the Oval Office. That would include conversations regarding the cover-up, the scandal. And once word got out that there were audio tapes that implicated Nixon himself, he decided to resign rather than face impeachment. Now, impeachment articles were drawn up, but before they could be voted on in the House, before they could officially impeach him, he did the honorable thing, realized he was toast, and resigned. Now, the rest of the 1970s is a pretty dismal decade to talk about. Confidence and trust in the government were at an all-time low. The U.S. was facing stagflation, economically speaking, which is a recession combined with high inflation, something that's not supposed to happen. It decreased purchasing power, recession, but people couldn't buy things because of the higher prices due to inflation. This would lead to drastic layoffs within factories across the country, including my dad. We would face both an energy crisis brought on by a cut in oil from overseas imports and an environmental crisis by our reliance on industry. So the 70s were a rough time. Americans no longer trusted their government due to the issue of LBJ and the Vietnam War and then Nixon and Watergate. We are facing an economic crisis that no one knows how to fix, stagflation. Because the problem with stagflation is if you pump more money in the economy, which is usually the way you get out of a recession, is government spending. The problem with government spending, government injected money in the economy, is it produces more inflation. And we're already facing high inflation due to stagflation. We face an energy crisis due to foreign countries withholding their oil exports to us. We also face an environmental crisis brought on by a century of industrialization. We also are facing a failed education system. that seemed to only get worse. In 1974, the Supreme Court case Law versus Nichols. The court ruled unanimously that school districts had the duty to meet the linguistic needs of children who had a limited grasp of English under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So, yay! This is a good thing, finally, right? And again, this case was technically directed about the Chinese, but it applied to all groups. It was a seeming win for Mexicanos who had long sought bilingual education. But this ruling was viewed with abject hostility by the mostly Anglo-educated, who viewed it as a threat to U.S. institutions, who were concerned that they would become, well, obsolete. Their argument was simple. Spanish-speaking students lived in the United States. It was their burden to learn English and be American. Teachers should not have the duty or the burden to learn Spanish to teach them. Boy, that sounds familiar. By the mid-1970s, the Civil Rights Commission had found that many school districts in the country still enforced the no Spanish rule. In California, 13.5% of schools discouraged any use of the Spanish language. Now, 13.5% doesn't seem so bad, unless you're one of those children in one of those schools. In Texas, it was 66.4%. 2/3 of all schools in the state of Texas enforced a strict no Spanish rule. It would dish out punishment if you were caught speaking Spanish. And technically speaking, the 1974 Supreme Court ruling in Law versus Nichols would rectify this, because the government was forcing states and schools to do this. But funding to these programs to enforce this and make sure that teachers are being trained and being hired would be gutted in the 1980s by Ronald Reagan. So, yeah, despite a seeming apparent victory in the Supreme Court case, due to lack of funding and enforcement, it still sucked. Now, I want to note that it was not all bad. There was some positives in the 1970s. We saw, of course, the success of Cesar Chavez in California, and that success would continue to spread across the country, and the movement itself for farm workers would continue to spread. Not only would the boycotts continue to spread across the country, which we talked about a while back ago, but it was during the 1970s that a new farm worker organization, apart from Chavez in the NFW, the NFW would develop in the Midwest and Great Lakes region. In Ohio and Michigan, farm workers would form the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, or FLOC, that not only organized Mexicano farm workers to strike for better wages and working conditions, but also sensitized Midwesterners to the abuses of the INS, Immigration Nationalized Services. And the thing is, the FLOC would have support in the Great Lakes region, in large part thanks to those Catholic bishops and the United Auto Workers Union. And the FLOC will lead a more than 5-year nationwide boycott of Campbell's soup in the early 1980s that would result in a union contract with better wages, better working conditions, and better standards. Now, again, all is not perfect. I can give you testimony after testimony of workers who talked about the late 70s and early 80s, talking about how, yeah, there were some rules that would prevent farmers from spraying pesticide on the crops while the workers were in the fields, but nothing stopped them from spraying the field next door to where the farmers were working, which means that Mexicano farm workers were being sprayed with harmful pesticides. In addition, they were eating farm workers would often, snack on some of the crops they were picking. It was allowed. But they didn't realize they had to wash the fruit first because they were told that pesticides weren't harmful. They were not informed. But the idea of organizing farm workers, and it is finally by the end of the 1970s when farm workers will achieve a major victory. They will get their own Wagner Act that will guarantee their right to organize. But we'll talk more about that next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.